Hi guys, so this is the first video in our lesson on the action potential. Just a quick reminder of a few things. First of all, contact information. Note that I have changed my office hours in this block. They're now 11 to 12 and 1 to 2 on Fridays. I thought that would be a day when you guys would be more likely to be on campus for things like clinical skills. So I did switch it to that. If you download the materials for your Monday case and you get a chance to go through them and you have some questions, you can contact me on Sundays. I switched from Saturdays to Sundays to give you guys more time to go through those materials and get questions. And I also noticed that you guys probably don't like coming in on a weekend. That's not a great surprise. It used to be that students would be right across the street at Center Court Gardens, and of course that's shut down now, so you guys are coming in from quite a ways away. Some of you guys are, and I totally understand why you may not want to come in and visit me in a room to ask, although that's convenient. So I'll be at home, but I will be at this link from 10 to noon, and if you have a question, this should be very easy for you to use and ask a question on, particularly if you have a camera and a microphone. Particularly a microphone. That could be a very handy thing. But you don't have to. You can just send a message and I can communicate with you through the messenger. I can share my desktop. I can show you slides. I can kind of take you through a few things and give you a thorough answer maybe I wouldn't be able to do in an email. Of course, I'm always available by appointment, and there is a video in a commentary in the notes for this section. You are not responsible for material in commentaries. They're just FYI. They're questions I've been asked frequently in the past. I know, it isn't nice when you have material where you're saying know this, don't know this in the reading material, but I thought this had more advantages, disadvantages to it, so I left it in. But note that the videos in those commentaries are optional, and I will assume that you have not read them. Sometimes they can help if I've confused you in some way, or if you want a brief superficial introduction to the material before we go in depth. Note that the materials have been prepared such that the written material is notes on the video, so you should be able to follow along in the notes figure to figure without taking any notes other than making the occasional highlight or annotation here and there. If you don't want to do that, it's fine. Either watching the videos or reading the notes alone is sufficient. You do not have to do both. You can do one or the other. It's just fine. If you think my notes are too long, you think I'm a verbose, pontificating, arrogant SOB, don't read them. Watch the video. It's fine, okay? And that will be true from here on out with me. This is a review. So this is a review of the action potential. Up front, I'll say, if you remember the stuff from VFG and you're comfortable with it, and you're comfortable that you remember it, you can just stop watching this video now and move on to the next assignment, okay? If you're not comfortable that you've remembered it all, or you don't feel like you really got it down in VFG, then you're probably going to want to at least briefly scan the notes and or maybe watch this video at double time or something like that, okay? Because it's just the same material that you had in VFG. I will not be testing directly over the material. I'm not going to be flipping open the notes and asking you detailed questions about the resting potential. But I am going to assume that you know how the resting potential is established, how action potentials are fired and what their properties are for the subsequent material, and so will everyone else throughout the movement and mechanics and the neuro block, okay? So in that respect, you need to be familiar with the material and be ready to apply it to new material that you're going to get. For instance, the next lesson is on synapses. That will be completely new to you, okay? All right, so that's what the word review means. All right, so let us move along here. This is my overview slide. You do not have this in the notes. It's in the skeletal muscle lecture, which is coming up. So skeletal muscle lesson, which is coming up. But I just provide this as an overview for you so you can see where we're at. Basically, you've got your nerve coming down from the brain through the spinal cord, and it goes out, and information in the form of action potentials propagates along, and it hits this terminus of the nerve fiber here, okay, the terminal. And this is the neuromuscular junction. It is the classical synapse. We'll be covering that in the next lesson. So the signal, the action potential comes through, it fires, there's a neurotransmitter released here. That neurotransmitter binds to the cell membrane of the skeletal muscle, otherwise known as sarcolemma, just like it was in cardiac. That will generate an action potential which will propagate through the sarcolemma down into the T-tubules. You will get calcium release in response to that action potential. That calcium causes contraction. So I am taking you through that process. We started with the resting potential, the most basic thing that you need to know about the nerve membrane and the sarcolemma. And now we're going to talk about action potential generation. And from there, we're going to talk about what happens in this synapse and in nerve-to-nerve synapses as well. And then from there, we will talk about skeletal muscle in association with your next case. All right, so that's where we're headed. That's the overall plan. Okay, and this, again, this video is review for you guys. So let's talk a little bit about action potentials. These are initiated by a membrane depolarization. So our membrane is sitting at rest in a nerve or in a skeletal muscle, and something, which we will talk about, causes that membrane to depolarize, and you fire an action potential, which is a transient change in the membrane voltage that is generated by the opening of voltage-gated ion channels and the change in permeability to those ions that takes place. We'll talk about that. You will note that all of these action potentials are different shapes. We talked about the cardiac ones and VFG. We are concentrating on the neuronal and the skeletal muscle here. They're fortunately very similar, so not hard to talk about both. They are different shapes because we have different ionic channels. And one thing you might want to note right up front is that although we talk about the sodium channel in cardiac muscle, ventricular muscle, and in nerve and skeletal muscle like it's one channel because they all pretty much act the same, you should note that there are many different types of sodium channels. They are encoded by different genes in different tissues, and if you get a mutation in a gene, it may cause problems with a sodium channel in a skeletal muscle, myocyte, but not in neuron or ventricular muscle because those sodium channels are encoded by different genes, even though they act pretty much the same. So we're going to talk about fast sodium channels like they're all one channel, but for instance, but you should know that they're generated by different genes. Same thing with the potassium channels. You guys know now, there's a wide variety of potassium channels. And you ran into a number of them in the ventricular myocytes. That won't be a great surprise. But even the ones of the same type are often encoded by different genes in different tissues. All right? So let's talk first about this upstroke. As you hopefully may recall, this is generated in neurons, skeletal muscle, and ventricular muscle, and atrial, of course, by sodium channels opening. So what happens is you increase the permeability to sodium, as you should remember now from the resting membrane review. When you increase the permeability to an ion, the voltage migrates towards that ion's equilibrium potential. So we sit at rest, we have the highest permeability to potassium, and our membrane voltage is very close to the Nernst potential for potassium. Now we open a bunch of sodium channels really fast. Sodium rushes in, positive charge accumulates inside the cell, the membrane voltage rises inside relative to outside, and it rises toward the Nernst potential for sodium because we've increased the permeability for sodium. And we've done it in a massive way very quickly, so our voltage shoots up to the sky. So this upstroke generated by sodium channels in these tissues and by calcium channels in the SA node and the AV node, okay? And of course that's most relevant when you're treating a cardiac patient or somebody's, any patient with calcium channel blockers. If you see a lengthening of the PR interval, you know that represents the AV nodal delay, and at least the PQ interval does. And so you'll slow the propagation of this action potential down. If you block calcium channels are the sodium channels of the SA and AV node. All right. These channels open via gates. We will talk about that in detail a little bit later. Okay. There are activation gates which open, which cause this increase in permeability. The voltage shoots to the sky. There are inactivation gates which close, in the case of sodium channels, at high voltage. And that shuts the sodium current down and decreases the permeability to sodium. The inactivation gate closes. It clogs up that channel, stops the sodium from going through, and obviously, that happens with a delay. So the activation gates open quick. The inactivation gates close. They're lazy, worthless, and weak. They don't they don't close to any significant extent until you're well into the action potential, close to the peak here. Okay. As we decrease our permeability to sodium, we increase the permeability to potassium through potassium channel activation. Those gates flip open with a delay, of course, because they flip open late here, and your voltage comes back down toward rest, okay? And of course, that is more gradual than the sodium channel opening. It doesn't really happen to a great extent until later in the action potential, and that's why your voltage drops later in the action potential. So characteristics of action potentials, we have a depolarizing phase, which is coming up and going less negative from rest. We have the repolarization phase, which is coming back down toward rest. And we have the overshoot, which is sometimes the name of this portion that goes past 0 and into the positive range. Some people call that the overshoot, okay? We have our after potential, which we'll talk about in a minute, okay? And this is a hyperpolarizing after potential, because the voltage actually sinks down below rest and then comes back up. We'll talk about that in a minute. Action potentials are all or none. They either fire or they don't, okay? They're non-decremental, which means that as they propagate, they are the same height and length throughout the cell, okay? So if this action potential is propagating through this cardiac myocyte from here to here, the same action potential shape will be generated here as is generated here, as is generated here, okay? And that holds generally throughout the same tissue, certainly throughout the same cell, okay? They have refractory periods when this action potential is generated, your membrane voltage is high, and your sodium channel inactivation gates begin to close. And so during this action potential and immediately afterwards, it's difficult, or in the case of during the action potential, impossible to generate another action potential. We call that the refractory period, okay? And it is unidirectional, which means that it propagates in one direction, all right? So my action potential is propagating down this myocyte from left to right. And the reason it's unidirectional is because when you depolarize the membrane right here, right where my finger is, okay, the membrane behind this point is firing or is just fired, which means that it is refractory. So the action potential can't propagate back in this direction. So it must propagate forward, and that means that it propagates in a unidirectional way. It has to propagate into membrane that is not fired yet, where the membrane is not refractory. So that's why it's unidirectional. And there is a threshold potential, and do note that this is not a standard value. It does vary, and we'll talk about what characteristics cause that to vary, cause it to go up or come down. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And once again, action potentials propagate. So in this case, we're propagating left to right unidirectionally, okay? So that if you fire an action potential here, it's going to propagate along the membrane into areas that have not fired an action potential yet, okay? So in that respect, we get propagation. What happens is you get positive charge in the form of sodium for nerve and skeletal muscle. It comes in, and what it does is it depolarizes. Of course, it brings the voltage up in the membrane right underneath the channels that you just opened, but it also brings it up a little bit in the adjacent membrane, and that causes the channels in this part of the membrane to open and fire. So this part of the membrane will hit threshold. You'll fire an action potential here. The next part of the membrane will be a little bit depolarized because you'll have brought more sodium in here, and so that'll cause this portion of the membrane to fire, and so on, and you'll propagate across the cell. So that's the way it works. All right, let's start with describing the sodium and potassium channels in the next video, and go from there. Thanks.